In 1875, as Europe's imperial age reached its roaring peak, one of the most significant financial transactions in modern history took place, a deal that would quietly define the balance of global power for generations. Britain's empire, vast yet hungry, set its eyes on a new artery of the world, the Suez Canal. The French had dug it, connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, slicing weeks off the voyage to India, Britain's crown jewel. The problem was money. The solution? A discreet but mighty name, N.M. Rothschild and Sons. When Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli's government needed £4 million to secure Britain's share of the canal, it wasn't the Crown's treasury that came to the rescue, it was the Rothschild Bank. With a single transaction, the family didn't just lend gold, they bought influence over the arteries of empire. 7 years later, Britain would seize control of Egypt and the canal entirely, a geopolitical masterpiece built, in part, upon Rothschild capital. But to understand how this Jewish family from Frankfurt became the silent financiers of empires, we must travel back a century earlier, to the narrow streets of Germany where a red shield hung above a modest home. Their name, Rothschild, literally meant red shield. It was a marker, perhaps from an inn or a signpost, but soon it would symbolize protection, ambition, and an empire of its own kind, one of gold instead of steel. The family's origins stretched back to the 16th century, rooted in the small Jewish communities of Central Europe. Europe's Jews, often exiled from kingdoms like France and England, had fled eastward to places like Poland and the German states, seeking refuge from persecution and the aftermath of the Black Death. For centuries, they lived on the margins of society, barred from land ownership, guilds, and most professions. Yet, they found opportunity where others saw sin, in lending money. Usury was forbidden by Christian law, but it became one of the few paths open to Jewish families. Out of necessity grew expertise, and out of centuries of exclusion, financial brilliance was born. The Rothschilds, by the late 1600s, were already moneylenders in Frankfurt. A modest trade, but one that would one day fund wars, industries, and empires. By the 18th century, as Europe simmered with trade, revolution, and the birth of capitalism, a single man would turn that family name into legend. Mayer Amschel Rothschild was born in Frankfurt on February 23, 1744. At the time, the city was a free imperial city, independent, bustling with traders, publishers, and money changers. His father, a small-time merchant, dealt in coins and lent modest sums to local nobles. The Rothschild home was crowded, alive with the chatter of relatives and the smell of ink and metal. Mayer's early world was one of ledgers and limitations, where a Jewish boy could dream, but only within the walls allowed to him. At just 13, Mayer was sent away to Hanover to apprentice under Simon Wolf Oppenheimer, a Jewish banker tied to the Hanoverian court, the same dynasty that ruled Britain. There, he learned the art of finance, valuation, negotiation, and most importantly, discretion. Money moved faster than armies, and Mayer began to understand the hidden geometry of power. 6 years later, he returned to Frankfurt, wiser and sharper. He began dealing in rare coins and lending to the city's small aristocracy. His reputation grew quietly as someone who could be trusted with both wealth and secrets. When William IX, the Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel, one of Germany's richest princes, sought someone to manage his fortune, Mayer was the natural choice. It was the connection that changed everything. By 1785, Mayer Rothschild was no longer a small-time trader. He was custodian of one of Europe's largest private fortunes, a financial operator at the center of an empire of coin. And just as he was building his career, the world outside was about to ignite. In 1789, the French Revolution shattered Europe's old order. Kings were overthrown, markets collapsed, and chaos spread like wildfire. Yet where others saw ruin, Mayer saw opportunity. As the crowned heads of Europe scrambled to fund their wars against revolutionary France, he began to lend, first to German princes, then to the great powers themselves. His genius was not only in money, but in neutrality. When nations fought, he financed both sides, discreetly, profitably, and always with an eye on the long game. By the time Napoleon's army swept across Europe, Mayer was already handling the wealth of princes and monarchs, hiding assets from invaders, and funding secret trade routes that slipped through Napoleon's continental system. It was dangerous work. Smuggling goods, evading blockades, and shifting fortunes from one frontier to another required courage and calculation. But Mayer thrived in chaos. Where generals saw maps, he saw ledgers. And in those ledgers, the future of Europe was being rewritten, in ink, not blood. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Rothschilds were no longer just bankers, they were power brokers. Mayer had built not just a fortune, but a network. His sons, trained with the same precision as his accounts, would soon carry the Red Shield into the capitals of Europe: London, Paris, Vienna, Naples. Each would found a branch of what became the first truly international financial empire. When Mayer died in 1812, as Napoleon's army froze in the snows of Russia, his legacy was already unstoppable. His family had mastered the art of invisible power, wealth without thrones, influence without armies. And from the ashes of revolution and war, a dynasty was born, one that would bankroat nations, outlast empires, and define the meaning of modern capital. When Mayer Amschel Rothschild died in 1812, the cannons of Europe still thundered. Napoleon's Grand Armée was retreating from the frozen ruins of Moscow, and the fate of nations hung in balance. Yet inside the Rothschild home in Frankfurt, something far more enduring than empire was taking shape: a plan for dynasty. Mayer had raised his sons not merely as heirs, but as extensions of himself. 5 arrows in a single quiver, each destined to pierce the financial heart of a different European capital. His will was not simply an inheritance, it was a strategy. The brothers were bound by strict rules. They were to marry within the family to preserve wealth, act in unity, and always remain discreet. A house divided, Mayer had once said, cannot stand. And the house of Rothschild would not fall, not to kings, not to revolutions, not to time. The eldest son, Amschel Mayer, stayed in Frankfurt to guard the family's roots. Solomon Mayer headed east to Vienna, the heart of the Habsburg Empire. Nathan Mayer, the most ambitious, crossed the Channel to London. Karl Mayer traveled south to Naples, the gateway to the Mediterranean. And the youngest, James Mayer, only 20, set off for Paris, the very city his father's generation had feared. 5 men, 5 cities, 1 empire without borders. Each brother carried not just letters of credit and gold, but something far more powerful: trust. In a Europe torn apart by war, where currencies collapsed overnight and thrones crumbled, the Rothschilds' word was as solid as any fortress. They spoke the one language all rulers understood: finance. Nathan, the third son, would soon become the most feared and admired banker in the world. When he arrived in London in the early 1800s, Britain was fighting for its life against Napoleon. The war had drained the treasury, debts soared, gold reserves dwindled. Nathan saw opportunity in crisis. He began purchasing British government bonds when others panicked, confident that Britain, with its navy, its colonies, and its iron will, would endure. But Nathan's brilliance wasn't only in numbers, it was in information. The Rothschild couriers, an invisible army of messengers, traders, and agents, moved faster than any government network. When Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo in 1815, Rothschild agents carried the news to London long before the official dispatch arrived. Legend has it that Nathan, knowing victory was near, calmly sold his government bonds, tricking the market into panic, only to buy them back moments later at a fraction of their value when the truth emerged. Whether myth or mastery, the story captured the essence of Rothschild power: knowledge, speed, and absolute nerve. That same year, Europe began to heal. The war was over, the map was redrawn. And the Rothschilds, who had financed kings, mercenaries, and ministries alike, were now at the center of Europe's economic rebirth. Their 5 branches, London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt, formed the first truly global banking network. Information, capital, and influence flowed between them with astonishing precision. Where armies had failed to unite Europe, the Rothschilds succeeded, not through conquest, but through credit. James Mayer, the youngest, was a force of nature in Paris. At 20, he was charming, ambitious, and utterly fearless. France, humiliated after Waterloo, sought to rebuild its industry and pride. James saw the moment. He established Des Rothschild Frères, the Paris branch of the family bank, in 1817. While other financiers hesitated, James bet big on France's industrial future, its railways, mines, and factories. He became banker to kings and the architect of the nation's economic revival. When Belgium won independence from the Netherlands in 1830, it was James who financed its new monarch, Leopold I. To Europe, the message was clear. When nations are born, the Rothschilds provide the midwife. Across the Channel, Nathan's London branch was rewriting the rules of global finance. Britain's empire was expanding, from India to Africa to the South China Sea, and every expansion needed funding. The Rothschilds became the empire's silent partners. Their gold built railways, armed fleets, and underwrote the trade of entire continents. They loaned the British government millions to compensate slave owners during the abolition of slavery in 1833, a paradoxical act that helped end one of humanity's darkest chapters. Even morality, it seemed, could be financed. By mid-century, the Rothschilds' reach was absolute. Their name whispered in palaces and parliaments, in the corridors of Vienna, the salons of Paris, the clubs of London. In 1822, Emperor Francis I of Austria, grateful for their wartime support, granted the brothers noble titles, Freiherr or Baron. 5 Jewish bankers, once confined to the Frankfurt ghetto, now entered the aristocracy of Europe. Their crest bore 5 arrows bound together, symbolizing unity, strength, and the indestructible bond of family. But behind the grandeur lay discipline. The Rothschilds did not flaunt their wealth. Their mansions were magnificent but restrained. Their public image discreet. Mayer's rules lived on. Wealth must serve purpose, not pride. They avoided politics publicly, but shaped it privately. No nation could wage war or build peace without first consulting the House of Rothschild. Yet not all branches thrived equally. Karl's Naples operation flourished for a time, maneuvering between Austrian and Bourbon interests, but the tides of Italian nationalism would later sweep it away. Still, even failure could not topple the dynasty. For every setback in one city, another Rothschild triumphed elsewhere. Their network was too wide, their influence too deep, their unity too strong. By the 1830s, they had achieved what no family in history ever had: a private banking empire that spanned Europe, one that could fund wars, rescue governments, and steer economies, all without firing a single shot. The crowned heads of Europe had their armies. The Rothschilds had their pens. And as the 19th century marched on, those pens would sign the checks that built the modern world. By the dawn of the 1830s, the Rothschilds were no longer just bankers, they were an institution. Across Europe, monarchs and ministers whispered their name with equal parts awe and unease. The family's emblem, 5 arrows bound together, had become more than a crest. It was a symbol of unity in an age of division, of a quiet, unseen empire that spanned the continent without armies, flags, or borders. London had become the beating heart of that empire. From his office on St. Swithin's Lane, Nathan Mayer Rothschild commanded a web of credit and correspondence that stretched from the banks of the Thames to the courts of Vienna and the salons of Paris. His letters, carried by a network of couriers faster than any state post, could shift the fate of nations before kings even heard the news. Money, he understood, was power, but information was sovereignty. Britain, triumphant after Waterloo, was now the world's greatest empire. It ruled the seas, dominated trade, and was beginning to knit its colonies together with steam and steel. But empires needed credit, and credit needed trust. Nathan provided both. When the British government faced a liquidity crisis in the 1820s, he lent millions to stabilize the treasury. When the global gold market fluctuated, he quietly bought up reserves, keeping Britain's monetary system afloat. Even the royal mint sought his counsel. To the public, he was a figure of mystery, the man who moved markets. To those who knew better, Nathan was the pulse of global finance. Yet, for all his influence, Nathan's ambitions extended beyond mere profit. In 1833, when Britain abolished slavery across its empire, the government faced the monumental task of compensating plantation owners. It was a moral reckoning and an economic catastrophe waiting to happen. Nathan provided the bridge. His bank arranged the massive loan that enabled emancipation, effectively financing the end of an empire built on human bondage. It was a paradox that defined the Rothschilds, profiteers and philanthropists, pragmatists and moralists, shaping history one ledger at a time. Meanwhile, across the Channel, James Mayer Rothschild was building an empire of his own. Paris in the 1820s was reinventing itself, industrializing, modernizing, dreaming of rivaling London. France, still haunted by the shadow of Napoleon, needed to rebuild its national pride through industry and progress. James became its financier. His bank, De Rothschild Frères, funded France's first railways, its mines, its steamship lines. He was not just lending money, he was building infrastructure, brick by brick, locomotive by locomotive. Northern France, Lille, Rouen, Valenciennes, became the beating heart of Europe's industrial revolution, fueled in no small part by Rothschild gold. When Belgium broke away from the Netherlands in 1830, James moved swiftly, financing the new Belgian kingdom and securing its bonds. In doing so, he made himself indispensable to the continent's newest nation, and quietly ensured that the Rothschilds were present at the birth of modern Europe. The Paris branch was more than a financial powerhouse, it was a social and political force. James's mansion on the Rue Lafitte became one of Paris's grandest salons, frequented by writers, scientists, and statesmen. There, behind glittering chandeliers, alliances were forged, investments discussed, and Europe's next moves quietly plotted. "Kings have their palaces," James once quipped, "but I prefer mine to be where the money meets the mind." In Vienna, Solomon Mayer Rothschild was weaving the same magic. The Habsburg Empire, vast but fragile, was struggling to modernize. Solomon became its banker, financing Austria's first railways and industrial ventures. His loans to the imperial government were so vital that the Austrian emperor himself would later ennoble the entire family. The Rothschilds of Vienna were no longer guests in the halls of power, they were pillars of it. Even Karl Mayer, in Naples, managed to thread the needle between Bourbon monarchs and Austrian diplomats. His bank financed southern Italy's trade and infrastructure, acting as both lender and political liaison. Though his branch would later falter as Italian unification swept the peninsula, Karl's presence helped cement the Rothschilds as continental arbiters of credit and diplomacy alike. By the mid-19th century, the Rothschild network had become the circulatory system of global capitalism. Their bonds funded governments, their gold stabilized currencies, and their letters of exchange powered trade from London to Bombay. The family's reach was so vast that the Times of London once declared, "The Rothschilds are the bankers of kings and the kings of bankers." Their power, however, was not without enemies. Whispered rumors painted them as puppet masters behind thrones, invisible hands pulling the strings of Europe. Anti-Semitic caricatures spread in pamphlets and papers, portraying the family as cold, calculating financiers manipulating the fate of nations. Yet, in reality, the Rothschilds were often the opposite, stabilizers in chaos, lenders of last resort when empires trembled on the brink. When revolution flared in 1848, their banks quietly helped governments rebuild, avoiding financial collapse that might have plunged Europe into anarchy. Their influence reached far beyond Europe. In 1822, as Brazil declared independence from Portugal, the new empire found itself burdened with debt and threatened with war. It was Nathan Rothschild who brokered the deal, lending enough to settle with Portugal and secure Brazil's sovereignty. The Rothschilds had financed not only kings, but now nations themselves. In their hands, credit was both weapon and shield. With it, they toppled obstacles, negotiated peace, and built worlds. By the 1840s, no major government in Europe could act without consulting a Rothschild. And yet, for all their reach, the family remained bound by Mayer's original code: loyalty, discretion, unity. They avoided ostentation, eschewed politics, and guarded their privacy with near religious devotion. "Think much, speak little, act wisely," Nathan had once said. It became the creed of a dynasty. But as Europe marched deeper into the industrial century of iron, coal, and empire, new challenges loomed. The Rothschilds had mastered the art of money. Now they would have to master the art of managing power itself. For, as empires expanded, revolutions stirred again. And soon, the Rothschild name would find itself entangled not only in the balance sheets of nations, but in the moral reckonings of history itself. By the middle of the 19th century, the Rothschilds stood at the summit of the modern world, a dynasty of financiers whose power was measured not in crowns or territories, but in credit, trust, and time itself. Their signature on a loan could rescue a collapsing empire. Their silence could send markets spiraling. Yet amid all their influence, the family seemed to follow an invisible rule: to build, not to destroy. To finance the machinery of civilization, even when that civilization was stained with turmoil and suffering. Europe was being remade by iron and steam. The railways, those new steel arteries of industry, were spreading like veins across the continent, carrying coal, ideas, and ambition. And behind many of these iron roads stood Rothschild gold. In London, Nathan Mayer Rothschild's successors, his sons Lionel, Anthony, and Mayer, poured vast sums into Britain's railway boom. It wasn't just an investment, it was a vision. Railways didn't merely move goods, they moved empires. They connected the industrial cities of Manchester and Birmingham to the ports of Liverpool and London, uniting an island economy that would dominate the world. In France, James Mayer de Rothschild did the same. His Paris branch became the heartbeat of continental industrialization. Through the 1830s and 1840s, he financed the Chemin de Fer du Nord, the Northern Railway, linking Paris to Belgium and beyond. It was more than infrastructure. It was the spine of the European economy. When the first trains thundered across the northern plains of France, their carriages carried not just passengers and coal, but the silent power of Rothschild capital. In Vienna, Solomon Mayer funded the great Austrian railways that stretched from the Alps to the Hungarian plains. His loans kept the Habsburgs' empire running smoothly, even as nationalism simmered beneath its surface. And in Italy, Karl Hayer's Naples branch attempted to do the same, financing trade routes and maritime ventures across the Mediterranean. For a time, all of Europe seemed to hum to the rhythm of Rothschild-led modernity. But while the rails carried wealth, another storm was gathering, one that no amount of money could easily calm. In the 1840s, a blight arrived in Europe that would test both the moral conscience and the practical reach of the Rothschild Empire. The humble potato, lifeblood of the poor in Ireland, Scotland, and parts of Central Europe, began to rot in the fields. Within a few seasons, famine swept across the land. In Ireland, entire villages starved. Corpses lined the roadsides. Mothers traded their wedding rings for bread. Over 1 million would die, and twice as many would flee. The British government hesitated, entangled in debates about free markets and charity. But the Rothschilds acted. Lionel de Rothschild, head of the London branch, became one of the chief financiers of the British Relief Association, established to aid famine victims. His family poured money into relief efforts, buying grain, funding soup kitchens, and financing ships that carried supplies across the Irish Sea. It was a gesture both pragmatic and humane, born from the same belief that had always guided the family. Wealth, if it meant anything, must serve a greater purpose. The same principle guided Lionel's compassion for Scotland. When famine reached the Highlands, worsening the misery caused by the forced clearances of crofters from their ancestral lands, he financed the Highland and Island Emigration Society, which helped thousands of Scots start new lives in the Americas and Australasia. Each act was a quiet rebellion against indifference, a testament that even in an age of ruthless profit, conscience could still have a place in finance. Lionel's moral courage extended beyond charity. In 1858, he became the first Jewish member of the British Parliament, breaking centuries of legal discrimination. For years, he had been elected by his constituency but barred from taking his seat, forced to swear a Christian oath that violated his faith. Again and again he refused. Finally, Parliament relented. When Lionel entered the House of Commons, it was more than a personal victory. It was a symbol of an ancient people slowly reclaiming their place in European life. His quiet dignity that day echoed far beyond Westminster, a triumph not of gold, but of principle. Meanwhile, across Europe, the Rothschilds' influence deepened in other ways. They financed the reconstruction of cities after revolutions, stabilized governments that teetered on bankruptcy, and supported emerging nations. When Brazil declared its independence from Portugal in 1822, it was Nathan Rothschild who brokered the financial settlement that allowed Brazil to gain peaceful recognition from its former colonizer. In return, the Rothschilds gained long-term influence in South American trade. Proof once again that moral diplomacy and business acumen could coexist. Their reputation, though immense, came at a cost. In the drawing rooms of Europe, whispers began to spread that the Rothschilds controlled nations, that no government could act without their consent. Anti-Semitic pamphlets painted them as puppet masters of kings and wars, the unseen rulers of a financial cabal. The irony was bitter. A family that had fought tirelessly for stability and progress now found itself accused of conspiracies born from fear and prejudice. Yet they never stooped to answer. The Rothschilds understood that power, like wealth, spoke best in silence. By the 1850s, the family's world seemed unshakable. They had survived revolutions, funded empires, and written their names into the DNA of modern capitalism. Their coat of arms, 5 arrows bound together, still symbolized unity, the secret to their endurance. From their drawing rooms in London, Paris, and Vienna, they looked out upon a Europe they had helped to build. Railways, mints, industries, and markets, all humming in the language of credit they had mastered. And yet, beneath the hum of industry, new tension stirred. Nationalism was rising again. The balance of Europe was shifting. Empires were at once expanding and unraveling. The Rothschilds' reach was vast, but even they could feel the tremors of an age that was about to turn. For the century that had made them kings of finance was about to test their empire like never before, with war, with moral conflict, and with a changing world that no ledger could contain. By the mid-19th century, the world the Rothschilds had helped shape was burning brighter and hotter than ever. Railways stitched nations together, steamships conquered oceans, and factories belched the smoke of progress into the skies. But behind this dazzling facade of prosperity, the engines of empire groaned under their own weight. Expansion demanded endless funding. Wars followed trade like shadows. And in this grand balancing act of ambition and ruin, the Rothschilds stood as both financiers and moral arbiters of an age intoxicated by its own reach. In Vienna, Salomon Mayer Rothschild had become the Habsburg Empire's indispensable banker. The Austrians, stretched across a patchwork of nations and languages, relied on his loans to modernize railways, rebuild after revolts, and hold their sprawling dominion together. Across Europe, kings and ministers understood that to have a Rothschild's confidence was to have credit, and to lose it was to risk collapse. Their letters crossed borders faster than armies, carrying not only figures but warnings, offers, and influence wrapped in the politeness of financial language. "Yours in utmost confidence," a Rothschild would write, and governments would breathe again. But even the most carefully balanced empire can be shaken by the tremors of history. In 1853, a war broke out that would test the Rothschilds' network to its limits, the Crimean War. On one side stood Russia, seeking dominance over the Ottoman Empire. On the other, a coalition of Britain, France, and Sardinia determined to halt Russian expansion. The war was a clash of empires, fought in frozen trenches and on distant shores, but its lifeblood flowed through London and Paris, not Crimea. Wars cost gold before they cost men, and both sides turned to the Rothschilds. In London, Lionel de Rothschild was approached by the British government. The war would be ruinously expensive, but Britain's gold reserves were stretched thin. Lionel provided what the crown could not raise fast enough: immense loans, issued discreetly and efficiently to keep the war machine running. It was a decision rooted not only in business but in conviction. Russia's oppressive policies toward its Jewish population, especially the Pale of Settlement, which forced millions of Jews into poverty and exile, had long appalled the Rothschilds. To finance the coalition that opposed the Tsar felt like a moral act as much as a financial one. The war raged for 3 bitter years, its human toll immense. When peace was finally declared in 1856, the coalition had achieved its aim. Russia's ambitions were checked, but the profits, for once, were modest. Lionel was never fully repaid. Yet the family's role in the conflict revealed something larger: that even in war, their influence was not merely economic. They were shaping the moral landscape of Europe, using finance as both sword and shield. Meanwhile, in the south of the continent, Karl Mayer Rothschild's Neapolitan branch was faltering. When he first arrived in Naples decades earlier, his task had seemed simple: establish a southern outpost of the family's empire and strengthen Austrian influence in Italy. The Bourbon kings who ruled the two Sicilies were wary of Austrian interference, but could not resist the lure of Rothschild credit. For a time, Karl played both diplomat and financier, lending money to monarchs while quietly advancing the Habsburgs' political interests. But by the 1850s, Italy was changing. A new force was rising: the dream of unification. Revolt spread through the peninsula, and the Rothschilds, associated with the old Austrian order, found themselves out of step with history. In 1860, Giuseppe Garibaldi and his 1,000 red-shirted volunteers swept through Sicily and southern Italy in a campaign that would forge the modern Italian state. The Bourbons fled, the Austrians lost their grip, and Karl's carefully built financial network crumbled overnight. Naples, once a jewel of the Rothschild Empire, was gone. The fall of the Neapolitan branch was the first real wound the dynasty had suffered. Yet, in the grand scheme of their history, it was little more than a lost limb. The family's influence in London and Paris was greater than ever, and new opportunities were rising across the seas. It was around this time that the Rothschilds' attention turned to South America, specifically Brazil. When Brazil had declared independence from Portugal in 1822, it did so not with revolution but with diplomacy. Still, the young empire faced a crippling financial problem. Portugal demanded enormous reparations in exchange for recognizing its sovereignty. Enter Nathan Rothschild, who crafted one of the most delicate deals of his career. Through a massive loan, he enabled Brazil to pay its debt peacefully, securing recognition from Lisbon and avoiding war. It was a transaction that defined the family's quiet genius: profit and peace intertwined, gold flowing where blood might have. The Rothschilds' influence reached far beyond finance. Their wealth funded science, art, and exploration. Their estates became centers of culture, filled with libraries, laboratories, and rare collections. In London, Nathaniel Rothschild, a later generation, would turn his passion for the natural world into a private museum of zoology that rivaled national institutions. The family's belief in progress was not limited to money. It extended to knowledge itself. Yet, for all their power and philanthropy, the Rothschilds could not escape the darker undercurrents of the age. As Europe industrialized, as nationalism spread, and economic inequality deepened, old prejudices found new voices. Anti-Semitism, which had simmered for centuries, began to mutate, no longer just religious, but racial, pseudo-scientific, conspiratorial. The Rothschilds, the most visible Jewish family in Europe, became its most convenient target. Pamphlets and cartoons portrayed them as puppet masters controlling governance, as secret rulers behind wars and revolutions. To the frightened and the envious, their financial brilliance was proof of conspiracy, their success evidence of a hidden hand. They were accused of orchestrating crises they had in fact prevented. The irony was cruel. And yet, the family refused to dignify such slander with public outrage. Their response, as always, was silence and endurance. Through it all, they continued to build. In Britain, their money fueled the Victorian Age, the railways, the telegraphs, the colonies, even the glittering stones of the Suez Canal, which the London branch helped the British government acquire in 1875. In France, their loans rebuilt Paris after its devastation in the Franco-Prussian War, transforming the city into the luminous capital of modern Europe. They were financiers of empires, yes, but also their architects. And yet, the price of empire was beginning to show. For every nation they lifted, another rose against them. For every war they financed to preserve balance, a new one threatened it. The Rothschilds had learned to master money, but now, as Europe hurtled toward its next great transformation, they would have to master something even harder. The volatile currents of modern power, where morality, nationalism, and ambition could no longer be balanced neatly in a ledger. The latter half of the 19th century belonged to the machine. Iron and steam had rewritten the laws of distance. Electricity was beginning to whisper through wires, and empires were racing to carve the globe into possessions and profits. Yet behind the thunder of locomotives and the roar of furnaces, the quiet sound of pen on parchment still decided the fate of nations. And that pen, more often than not, belonged to a Rothschild. The family's financial web now stretched across continents. In London, Lionel de Rothschild and his brothers oversaw the empire's lifeline of credit. In Paris, James Mayer de Rothschild had become the second most powerful man in France, just behind the king himself. The family's coat of arms, the 5 bound arrows, was no longer a private symbol. It was Europe's invisible guarantee, the mark that wars could be fought, cities rebuilt, and industries born. After the Crimean War, Europe's balance of power shifted again. France sought to reclaim its lost glory. Austria stumbled under internal unrest, and Prussia, rising, calculating, prepared for a future that would reshape the continent. Through it all, the Rothschilds remained essential. Their banks loaned money to rebuild what war had broken, to fund new railways, and to restore national confidence. Yet even their immense resources could not prevent the storms to come. In 1870, the Franco-Prussian War erupted, a brutal, short conflict that ended centuries of French dominance and gave birth to the German Empire. Paris was besieged, the proud city starved and surrendered. When the smoke cleared, the Rothschilds were once again the ones who turned chaos into order. Alphonse de Rothschild, heir to James's Paris branch, became one of the leading financiers of France's reconstruction. He helped the new Republican government secure the colossal indemnity demanded by Prussia, 5 billion francs, to regain occupied territories and rebuild the nation's shattered pride. While others despaired, the Rothschilds saw opportunity in restoration. They invested in France's recovery, financing railways, steel, and urban renewal. The wide boulevards and glowing lamps of Haussmann's Paris, the new symbol of European modernity, shone partly with Rothschild capital. Across the Channel, the London branch reached new heights. Britain's global empire was at its zenith. The Union Jack flew from the Cape to Cairo, from the Caribbean to Hong Kong. And though the British fleet carried the empire's power, it was Rothschild gold that kept its engines running. In 1875, Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli made one of the most audacious purchases in imperial history: the Suez Canal shares. The canal was the lifeline to India, the artery through which Britain's empire breathed. To secure it, Disraeli turned not to Parliament, but to the Rothschilds. Within 48 hours, they provided the necessary loan, £4 million, the equivalent of hundreds of millions today. It was more than a transaction. It was a demonstration of faith between empire and financier. The Rothschilds didn't just lend money, they lent legitimacy. And for their discretion, Britain gained its most vital passage to the east. But wealth and power have their own strange gravity. As the family's influence deepened, they began to move beyond pure banking, into industries that reflected the expanding material world. One of these was wine. In 1853, Nathaniel de Rothschild, a member of the English branch who had settled in France, purchased a vineyard near Bordeaux, Chateau Braun Mouton, later renamed Chateau Mouton Rothschild. His cousins followed, acquiring the legendary Chateau Lafite estates. It was a curious turn, a family of bankers becoming winemakers. But it reflected something deeper, a desire for permanence. Bonds matured, governments fell, but wine endured. And though their timing was poor, the dreaded phylloxera plague would soon ravage French vineyards. The Rothschilds weathered it. By the end of the century, their estates were not just survivors, but icons of French viticulture, their labels synonymous with luxury and endurance. Meanwhile, a far harsher fortune gleamed beneath African soil. In the 1870s and 1880s, explorers and entrepreneurs discovered vast diamond and gold fields in South Africa. The rush that followed was chaotic, a scramble of miners, imperialists, and dreamers. But amid the dust and greed stood a familiar pattern: the need for capital. The British colonialist Cecil Rhodes visioned an empire of minerals stretching across the continent, but even his ambition required funding. Once again, the Rothschilds stepped forward. The London and Paris branches became the principal backers of Rhodes's ventures, leading to the creation of De Beers Consolidated Mines, a company that would come to dominate the world's diamond trade. Through De Beers, the Rothschilds controlled not only the flow of precious stones, but a large portion of the gold trade that fueled global finance. It was an extraordinary irony. A family once confined to medieval ghettos now shaped the destiny of empires through the wealth hidden beneath African earth. But while their financial empire glittered, their private world remained disciplined, even austere. The Rothschilds maintained a code that bordered on sacred: unity, discretion, family above all. Their palaces were elegant, but never ostentatious. Their philanthropy, vast but quiet, funded hospitals, schools, and cultural institutions across Europe. They believed wealth was a responsibility, not a crown. Still, the burden of fame was heavy. By the 1880s, as nationalism and scientific racism spread through Europe, the Rothschilds became the unwilling symbols of every conspiracy about Jewish power. Newspapers caricatured them as spider-like financiers weaving webs over the world. The irony was cruel. The very family that had financed the abolition of slavery and fed starving millions was now painted as sinister manipulators of destiny. But the Rothschilds endured, as they always had, through silence and achievement. To be hated for one's success, one of them once remarked, is the price of having any success worth hating. In the twilight of the century, the family produced one of its strangest and most fascinating figures: Walter Rothschild of the London branch. Born in 1868, heir to vast wealth, Walter had little interest in banking. His obsession was nature. From childhood, he collected insects, birds, and animals of every kind. As an adult, he transformed his estate at Tring into one of the largest private natural history collections in the world. He rode giant tortoises across his lawns and famously drove a carriage pulled by zebras through the streets of London, to the astonishment of onlookers. He was eccentric, yes, but also brilliant. His research and donations helped found modern zoology museums, and many species were named after him. Walter embodied something rare within the Rothschilds' legacy, a reminder that their wealth, once born of survival, had become a force for curiosity and wonder. The family that once hid behind red shields now studied the colors of butterflies.
By century's end, the Rothschilds had lived through revolutions, famines, and wars, and emerged stronger after each one. They had financed the expansion of empires, yet also the emancipation of nations. Their influence stretched from the palaces of London to the mines of South Africa, from the vineyards of Bordeaux to the parliaments of Europe. But as the 20th century approached, the old world was trembling. Industrial power had changed the balance of nations. Empires that once borrowed from the Rothschilds were now arming for conflicts beyond imagination. The dynasty had mastered the art of surviving every storm. But the next one would be unlike any they had ever faced. The age of finance was about to meet the age of fire.
The 19th century had been the Rothschilds' masterpiece, a symphony of diplomacy, industry, and credit that kept Europe's ambitions alive and its economies in motion. But as the century turned, that harmony began to fracture. Beneath the glitter of progress, something dark was stirring. Empires were cracking from within, nationalism was rising like a fever, and the age of reason was slowly giving way to an age of resentment. For a family that had built its empire on trust, the coming decades would test not their wealth, but their endurance. The first tremor came not from war, but from ideology. Across Europe, new voices began to speak of racial purity and scientific hierarchies, poisons disguised as progress. Anti-Semitism, once the superstition of medieval minds, was reborn in the vocabulary of science and politics. And the Rothschilds, the most visible Jewish family in Europe, became its lightning rod. Caricatures began to appear in newspapers, hook-nosed financiers manipulating governments, Rothschild octopuses with tentacles wrapped around the globe. To the envious and the frightened, their power seemed unnatural. To the desperate, it seemed culpable. When the poor suffered, the rich were blamed. When nations stumbled, invisible enemies were imagined, and always the Rothschilds stood at the center of those imaginations. Yet the family did not answer with outrage. Their defense was the same as it had always been: quiet dignity, hard work, and results. In France, Alphonse de Rothschild, heir to James's fortune, was guiding the Paris branch through one of its most turbulent eras. After rebuilding Paris in the 1870s and helping to finance the French Republic's indemnity to Prussia, the family had become both indispensable and suspect. France's press loved them as symbols of prosperity and vilified them as symbols of privilege, often in the same breath. Then, in 1894, came the Dreyfus Affair, the great moral earthquake of the Third Republic. A Jewish army officer, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, was accused of treason, convicted on falsified evidence, and sent to rot on Devil's Island. The country erupted. On one side, the army and the nationalists cried for blood. On the other, intellectuals and progressives, led by writers like Émile Zola, demanded justice. Caught in the storm was Alphonse. Though not directly involved, the Rothschild name became a symbol in the polemic. To anti-Dreyfusards, the affair was proof of their favorite fantasy, a Jewish conspiracy undermining France. To defenders of justice, it was proof of how deeply hatred had corrupted the Republic. For 12 long years, the Dreyfus Affair tore France apart. When Dreyfus was finally exonerated in 1906, it was a victory for truth, but the scars remained. Through it all, Alphonse never wavered in his support for the Republic, quietly funding relief organizations and Jewish causes. His faith in civilization's better nature was unshaken, though the world around him was clearly changing. Meanwhile, in Vienna, the once mighty Austrian branch was beginning to feel the same unease. The Rothschilds had long been central to the Habsburg financial system, their bank, Credit Anstalt, a pillar of the empire's economy. But by the late 19th century, Austria-Hungary was an empire in decay. Its debts rising, its nationalities restless, its bureaucracy creaking beneath the weight of centuries. Still, the Rothschilds did what they had always done. They lent, stabilized, and advised. When the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867 created a dual monarchy, it was Rothschild diplomacy that helped finance the transition. For a time, Vienna's golden salons glittered again with confidence. But underneath the waltzes and chandeliers, the foundations were rotting. Then came the long depression of the 1870s, a global financial crisis that began with a stock market crash in Vienna and rippled through the world. The Rothschilds, though vast in wealth, were not immune. The Paris branch lost heavily in speculative ventures, particularly in the emerging oil industry. Alphonse had been among the first Europeans to recognize the potential of petroleum, founding the Caspian and Black Sea Oil Company, but he could not compete with John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil. The American Titan swallowed markets faster than the Rothschilds could adapt. For the first time in nearly a century, the family felt what it meant to lose. Worse yet was the creeping tide of state interference. The French government, increasingly influenced by socialism, began targeting private banks and consolidating control. Across the Channel, British politics were shifting too, labor movements rising, wealth taxes debated. The golden age of private banking was giving way to the industrial era of national finance. By the turn of the 20th century, the Rothschilds had become what they had never wanted to be, symbols of old wealth, of the ancien regime, of the establishment itself. Their discretion, once their greatest strength, now made them seem secretive. Their unity, once admired, now seemed suspicious. And as Europe stumbled toward its next great catastrophe, those perceptions would become dangerous. The storm began in Austria, where Credit Anstalt, the great bank founded by Anselm Salomon von Rothschild, had become the empire's financial heart. But hearts can fail. By the early 1900s, it was overextended. Too many acquisitions, too little liquidity. When World War I erupted in 1914, Austria's economy collapsed under the weight of war debt. The Rothschilds, like the governments they had served, were dragged into the maelstrom. It was a strange irony. The family that had financed the fall of Napoleon now watched the world plunge into another, far more devastating conflict, one that would destroy the very empires they had sustained. In London, Nathaniel Rothschild, the first Baron Rothschild, lent his support to Britain's war effort, just as his ancestors had done a century earlier. But this time, the stakes were different. The old European order, the monarchies, the diplomatic webs, the codes of courtesy, was dying in the trenches of the Somme and Verdun. Credit itself, the Rothschilds' weapon of choice, was no longer enough to shape events. The war was too vast, too irrational, too modern. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, the map of Europe was unrecognizable. The Austrian Empire was gone. The Ottoman Empire was gone. The German Empire was gone. Monarchs had fled or been executed. In their place stood fragile republics burdened by debt, resentment, and uncertainty. For the first time in their history, the Rothschilds were not restoring order. They were trying to survive it. And yet, amid the ruins, new opportunities flickered. The family's vast reserves of gold and their network of trust still made them indispensable. They helped finance the recovery of Austria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, lending to governments struggling to rebuild after collapse. But the old prestige was fading. In a world now ruled by ideologies instead of dynasties, their quiet pragmatism felt out of step. Where once their signature could steady the world, now even the Rothschilds could feel the tremors of forces they could not control. Nationalism, socialism, fascism. The crowns of Europe had fallen, and soon the flames that consumed them would come for everything the Rothschilds had built. When the First World War ended in 1918, the guns fell silent, but Europe itself seemed to exhale in exhaustion, an old man waking from a nightmare only to find his world unrecognizable. The great empires that had ruled for centuries, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, German, Russian, lay in ruins. In their place stood fragile new nations, uncertain republics, and revolutionary ideologies. The Rothschilds, who had once moved silently behind thrones, now faced a world where thrones themselves had vanished. For more than a century, the family's empire had been built on continuity, on governments that borrowed, rebuilt, and borrowed again. But now, the world's creditors had changed. The United States was the new financial power. The dollar, not the pound or franc, was becoming the language of global finance. And though the Rothschilds still held immense wealth and influence, their world, the Europe of kings, letters, and quiet diplomacy, was crumbling beneath their feet. Still, the family adapted, as it always had. In the 1920s, they turned their attention to the shattered economies of Central Europe. In Vienna, the once mighty capital of empire, the Kreditanstalt Bank, long a cornerstone of Austrian finance and founded generations earlier by Anselm von Rothschild, became the center of their operations. The post-war years were chaotic: inflation, unemployment, hunger. But the Rothschilds provided loans to governments desperate to stabilize their currencies. Their money rebuilt railways, refueled industry, and restored hope, at least for a while. In Paris, Edouard de Rothschild, the new head of the French branch, focused on rebuilding industries and investing in emerging technologies. Air travel, telecommunications, and electricity were reshaping the modern world. The Rothschilds, pragmatic as ever, shifted quietly into these new frontiers. Their banks financed reconstruction in Belgium, Czechoslovakia, and the Balkans, helping Europe stand again on trembling legs. For a moment, it seemed as if the old family magic still worked, that finance could once again bring stability to chaos. But the illusion didn't last. In 1931, disaster struck. Kreditanstalt, the Austrian banking giant the family had nurtured since the mid-1800s, announced that it could not publish its financial statements. The truth was grim. The bank had overextended itself, buying up smaller banks and financing risky ventures during the boom years of the 1920s. When the global economy began to collapse after the Wall Street crash of 1929, those investments turned toxic. The bank's insolvency triggered a panic that spread across Europe like wildfire. Lines of desperate depositors snaked through Vienna's streets. Governments scrambled to contain the crisis. The Rothschilds poured in their own money, trying to save what could not be saved. But the confidence that had taken them generations to build evaporated in days. Kreditanstalt collapse became one of the key catalysts of the Great Depression in Europe, dragging entire economies down with it. For the Rothschilds, it was more than a financial blow. It was a symbolic one. The family that had once stabilized Europe's markets now seemed powerless to save their own creation. The myth of infallibility, which had sustained their legend for a century, cracked open. Worse still, the political winds were turning vicious. The rise of fascism, first in Italy, then in Germany and Austria, brought with it a new and terrifying brand of hatred. Anti-Semitism, which had long lurked in whispers and pamphlets, now took center stage as official policy. To the fascists, the Rothschilds were not merely bankers, they were the perfect villains. Jewish, rich, cosmopolitan, and powerful. Nazi propaganda turned their history into a weapon. Posters and films depicted them as the hidden hand behind capitalism, communism, and every political conspiracy imaginable. In 1940, Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda even produced a film titled Die Rothschilds, portraying the family as manipulators who had engineered wars for profit. It was grotesque, but effective. In the eyes of millions, centuries of achievement were twisted into myth and malice. The nightmare became real in March 1938, when Germany annexed Austria in the Anschluss. Nazi troops marched into Vienna, cheered by crowds intoxicated with nationalism. For the Austrian Rothschilds, it was the end of an era.
Louis Nathaniel de Rothschild, the head of the Vienna branch, was arrested within days. The Gestapo seized his palatial estate, his bank, and his priceless art collection. For months, he was kept under house arrest, his every move monitored, while his family fled across the border into Switzerland. Many of the family's possessions, paintings, manuscripts, jewelry, were confiscated or sold under duress. Much of it would never be recovered. In Paris, the family watched the spreading darkness with growing alarm. Eduard de Rothschild transferred as many assets as he could to London and New York, preparing for the unthinkable. But when France fell to Nazi Germany in 1940, the Rothschild Bank there was nationalized under the Vichy regime. The family's estates were seized, their vineyards in Bordeaux confiscated, their art collections looted. For the first time in their history, the Rothschilds were not the lenders of nations, they were refugees of history. Yet even as the walls closed in, the family's network of courage and connection endured. Members of the London branch, particularly Victor and Anthony de Rothschild, played active roles in Britain's war effort. Their contacts and capital helped finance military production, and their political influence quietly supported the Allied cause. Some branches of the family aided Jewish refugees fleeing Europe, using their wealth and diplomatic reach to secure visas and transport. Still, the cost was immense. The Rothschilds had survived revolutions, market crashes, and wars, but World War II was different. It targeted not just their fortunes, but their identity. Being a Rothschild, being Jewish, was enough to invite extermination. By the war's end, many family members had lost everything. Estates in Austria, France, and Germany lay in ruins. Art collections that had once graced the walls of palaces now hung in Nazi museums or private collections. But the family survived, scattered, scarred, and yet unbroken. In London, the old motto of Mayer Amschel Rothschild still held: Concordia, Integritas, Industria. When the Nazis fell and Europe began to rebuild, the Rothschilds did what they had always done. They began again. The war had erased empires, but it had not erased their instincts. The world that emerged from the ashes, divided between East and West, communism and capitalism, needed credit, stability, and trust. And though diminished, the Rothschilds still had all three. The age of monarchs had ended. The age of ideology had begun. And once again, in the quiet offices of London and Paris, the family of the Red Shield began to write their next chapter, not as masters of Europe, but as survivors of its madness.
When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world the Rothschilds had once known was gone. The palaces of Europe were scarred, the old monarchies extinguished, and the faith in civilization itself seemed irreparably broken. The family that had served as the bankers of kings now faced a new age without kings, a new order born not from diplomacy and dynasties, but from rubble and reckoning. For more than a century, the Rothschilds had stood at the invisible heart of Europe's stability. But now, even their name could not guarantee what had been lost. The family's continental branches were devastated. The Vienna house was gone, looted, nationalized, its art and estates confiscated by the Nazis and then seized again by the Soviet-backed government that replaced them. The Paris branch, stripped during the war, faced years of legal struggle to reclaim its properties from the wreckage of Vichy bureaucracy. And yet, out of this ruin, the family did what it had always done: adapt, rebuild, endure. In London, the House of Rothschild had survived intact. Its vast archives, its gold reserves, its reputation, all had weathered the war, thanks in no small part to the prudence of Victor Rothschild, the third Baron Rothschild, who had played a vital role in Britain's defense. A scientist by training and a patriot by conviction, Victor had joined the intelligence services during the war, working in counter-espionage and bomb disposal. He risked his life disarming unexploded bombs during the Blitz, and later helped design new methods for detecting enemy mines. For a man born into unimaginable wealth, it was a startling humility and a fitting reflection of his generation's sacrifice. When peace returned, Victor and his cousin Anthony de Rothschild turned their attention to rebuilding the family's financial empire. The world had changed. The great private banking dynasties of the 19th century, Baring, Morgan, and Rothschild alike, were giving way to corporate finance and government oversight. The new economy ran on institutions, not individuals. But the Rothschilds, with their deep understanding of global trade and their network of trust, still had a role to play. In France, Guy de Rothschild, son of Edouard, took on the Herculean task of restoring the Paris branch, des Rothschild Frères. The challenges were immense. The Vichy regime had stripped the family of citizenship, seized their assets, and left their reputation tainted by propaganda. But Guy possessed his ancestors' quiet steel. He began rebuilding from scratch, reopening offices, reclaiming properties, and reigniting confidence among clients who had once turned to the family as their last resort in crisis. By the 1950s, des Rothschild Frères was once again one of France's most trusted investment banks, financing industries that would define post-war recovery: steel, transport, and energy. Guy became not merely a banker, but a symbol of resilience, proof that survival itself could be an act of defiance. The Chateau Lafite and Mouton Rothschild vineyards, too, rose from their wartime wounds. Both estates had been seized by German authorities during the occupation, their cellars pillaged, their workers displaced. But the family reclaimed them after liberation, reviving production and innovation. Baron Philippe de Rothschild, head of the Mouton branch, transformed winemaking into an art form, blending tradition with modern marketing. His idea of commissioning famous artists to design Mouton's wine labels turned the bottles into collector's pieces, merging art, commerce, and legacy in a single stroke. In 1973, Mouton Rothschild achieved something no one thought possible. It was officially elevated to Premier Cru Classé status, the highest rank in Bordeaux wine, an honor denied it for more than a century. The motto Philippe adopted said everything about the Rothschild story. Premier ne puis, second ne donne, Mouton suis. First, I cannot be. Second, I refuse to be. I am Mouton. It was a statement not of arrogance, but persistence. The spirit that had carried the family from the Frankfurt ghetto to the pinnacles of power. Meanwhile, in Britain, the London branch began reshaping itself for the modern era. The days of financing empires were over. The future lay in investment banking and venture capital. Under the guidance of Jacob Rothschild, the family shifted focus from government loans to international development, energy, and technology. Their influence moved from palaces to boardrooms, from monarchs to markets. The family's long-standing expertise in gold trading and commodities gave them a strategic edge in the volatile economies of the 1970s. As inflation surged and currencies wobbled, investors turned once again to Rothschild for stability. The same reason governments had done so a century before. The N.M. Rothschild & Sons Bank became a central player in bullion trading, managing the daily gold fix in London, a ritual that set global prices and quietly reaffirmed their relevance in a transformed world. But it wasn't just finance that defined the family's post-war rebirth. The Rothschilds emerged as patrons of art, science, and conservation, using their resources to rebuild not only wealth, but culture. Miriam Rothschild, a brilliant naturalist and one of Victor's sisters, became one of Britain's foremost zoologists, publishing groundbreaking studies on parasites and ecology. She championed wildlife protection long before it became fashionable, and campaigned for the preservation of endangered species, a legacy of intellect and compassion that echoed the curiosity of her eccentric ancestor Walter. Still, even in peace, the Rothschilds' name carried the weight of myth, and not all of it benign. The old conspiracies that had followed them through the 19th century were reborn in new forms. In the age of mass media, whispers became headlines. In the age of ideology, suspicion became dogma. The family's discretion, once a virtue, became fuel for fiction. They were accused of controlling the world's central banks, orchestrating wars, or pulling invisible strings. Nonsense that would have been laughable if it weren't so persistent. Yet, true to form, the Rothschilds responded not with denial, but with silence. They understood what Mayer Amschel had known 2 centuries earlier. Influence is most powerful when unseen. By the late 20th century, the family had become less a single dynasty than a constellation. Branches in London, Paris, Zurich, and New York, each independent but bound by name and ethos. They had moved beyond the age of kings and revolutions, beyond famine and fascism, into a modern world that measured power differently. No longer the bankers of empires, they were now the architects of global finance, shaping investments, fostering innovation, and advising governments and corporations alike. Their story had come full circle, from survival to supremacy to survival again. And though the red shield no longer hung above the alleys of Frankfurt, its legacy endured. A family that had outlasted nations, rewritten the laws of power, and proved that true wealth was not gold or land, but endurance. The old Europe that had birthed them was gone, but something of its spirit lived on. In the quiet hum of trading rooms, in the clink of wine glasses in Bordeaux, and in the relentless curiosity that kept them reaching beyond themselves. For the Rothschilds, history had always been a ledger. Wars on one side, rebuilding on the other. Empires lost, trust gained. And at the bottom of every page, in letters that had survived revolution, persecution, and war, the balance was always the same. They endured. By the dawn of the 1980s, the Rothschilds were no longer merely a family of bankers. They had become a global institution, woven into the fabric of modern capitalism itself. The old world of monarchs and ministers had given way to corporations, markets, and multinationals. But the family's quiet, strategic presence remained, pulsing beneath the surface of global finance like an ancestral heartbeat. In London, Jacob Rothschild, the 4th Baron Rothschild, emerged as one of the most visionary financiers of his generation. Charismatic, sharp, and unafraid to challenge tradition, Jacob saw that the 20th century's true frontier was no longer empire or land. It was information and innovation. Under his leadership, the family's interests shifted decisively toward modern finance. Mergers, acquisitions, venture capital, and global investment. He expanded the Rothschild reach beyond Europe, to the United States, Asia, and the Middle East, building a network that reflected a new kind of power, decentralized, data-driven, global. But Jacob's ambitions also brought conflict. In the 1980s, disagreements with his cousin Evelyn de Rothschild, head of the London banking house N.M. Rothschild & Sons, led to a split that rocked the financial world. Jacob left the family firm to form RIT Capital Partners, an independent investment trust that would become one of Britain's most respected financial institutions. Critics called it a schism. Historians saw it as evolution. For the Rothschilds, division had always been part of their genius. 5 brothers, 5 cities, 5 paths. And now, 5 generations later, it was happening again on a global scale. While Jacob forged new paths, Evelyn de Rothschild continued to steer N.M. Rothschild & Sons with the same composure and precision that had defined the family for 2 centuries. Under his leadership, the London house advised governments on privatization, guided corporations through transition, and remained a discreet but powerful voice in global markets. In 2003, Evelyn merged the British and French branches into Rothschild & Co., uniting the family's transnational legacy under one name again, a modern echo of Mayer Amschel's original dream of unity. Meanwhile, in France, the post-war recovery had given rise to a new generation of Rothschilds who combined old-world elegance with modern audacity. David de Rothschild, son of Guy, rebuilt the French banking house after it had been nationalized by the socialist government in 1982. Refusing to let history repeat itself, he founded a new company, Rothschild and C. Bank, in 1986, starting again from zero, as Mayer Amschel once had in Frankfurt. By the 2000s, Rothschild and C had grown into one of Europe's most influential investment banks, advising world leaders and major corporations. The family had lost their castles, but gained something far greater: agility. Their ventures now spanned energy, telecommunications, biotech, and green finance. In an era defined by digital revolutions and globalization, the Rothschilds remained what they had always been: translators of change. Their secret was not the gold they owned, but the trust they inspired. For more than 200 years, through revolutions and recessions, through propaganda and persecution, the family name had come to signify something rare in finance: stability. And yet, their power had transformed. Gone were the days when a Rothschild signature could rescue an empire. The modern world had grown too vast, too interconnected for any family to wield such influence. Instead, their strength lay in continuity, in surviving where others vanished, in adapting to systems that devoured those who resisted change. Beyond banking, the Rothschilds began to embody a different kind of legacy, one of philanthropy, science, and preservation. Their estates, once symbols of wealth, became sanctuaries of nature and culture. The Waddesdon Manor in Buckinghamshire, built by Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild in the 19th century, was gifted to the National Trust and became one of Britain's most visited heritage sites, its art collections rivaling national museums. Miriam Rothschild's pioneering work in ecology helped establish modern conservation biology. In France, the family founded foundations supporting medical research, education, and humanitarian aid. In Israel, they funded universities, museums, and agricultural development. Echoing their ancestor Edmund de Rothschild, the father of the Yishuv, who had supported Jewish settlements in Palestine long before the founding of the state. If the 19th century had been the age of their power, the 20th was the age of their conscience. They no longer sought to rule the markets. They sought to sustain the world that markets threatened to consume. In the 21st century, Rothschild & Co. became one of the most respected financial advisory firms on the planet, guiding governments and global companies through crises, mergers, and transformations. They advised on European Union restructurings, sovereign debt negotiations, and multinational sustainability investments. Quietly, without spectacle, they had returned to what they had always been best at: helping nations navigate uncertainty. But myths, like shadows, never vanish. Even in an age of transparency, conspiracy theories about the Rothschilds persisted. Echoes of centuries-old prejudice, amplified now by the megaphone of the internet. Wild claims circulated online: that they controlled central banks, that they owned world leaders, that they manipulated events for profit. None of it was true, but the persistence of these fantasies only proved one thing: that the family's name, once whispered in royal courts, had become part of the global imagination, half legend, half truth, entirely immortal. Today, the Rothschilds no longer seek to be the richest nor the most powerful. Their influence lies in something subtler: duration. Where empires fell, where dynasties vanished, where currencies collapsed, their name endures. Their motto, first carved above the doorway of a humble house in Frankfurt 2 centuries ago, still tells the story of their survival: Concordia, Integrita, Industria. Unity, integrity, industry. It was more than a creed, it was a prophecy. For in every era of chaos, the Rothschilds found a way to turn catastrophe into creation, prejudice into perseverance, loss into legacy. They had seen kings rise and fall, markets boom and crash, nations born and broken. And through it all, the family of the Red Shield remained. Theirs is not merely a story of wealth, but of endurance. The endurance of vision, of faith, of family.
From a cramped ghetto in Frankfurt to the corridors of modern power, the Rothschilds built an empire not of conquest, but of connection. And though the world no longer runs on letters sealed in wax or gold sent by courier, the spirit of their enterprise endures wherever trust, courage, and intellect meet. The age of empires is over. The age of finance has evolved. But the legend of the Rothschilds, the family who outlasted history, continues to whisper in every boardroom, in every market, and in every age that rises from the ashes of the last. They were never kings. They were something rarer. They were survivors who learned to shape the world and then to outlive it.